Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Speaker, I'll begin by correcting what I think is a misrepresentation of the real position in respect of wages that Mr. Foss, the prior Speaker, said in his contribution. He said that after tax, real wages have increased by a certain percentage. I forget, by 6%, I think it was that he said, since the date of the last election. Of course, these averages can be very deceptive. That's only if you include the top 10% of income earners. The reality, no, that's true. If you take out, if you look at the spectrum of wage increases across societal wages, more than half of New Zealand wage earners are earning less in real terms than they were at the last election, and it's only if you weight that average by including the 10% of salary and wage earners who profited handsomely under the National Party's income tax cuts, in fact got 42% of the tax cuts, that the average that Mr. Foss said is correct. So for the vast majority of New Zealanders, that is not the position that they personally found themselves in. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak more on a topic that Mr. Foss agreed was important, and that is savings. And one of the reasons I want to emphasise is that, as I said in an earlier contribution, page 70 of the budget shows the New Zealand's net international investment position as a percentage of GDP. And this is the figure that the Minister of Finance quite rightly has been emphasising in the House. This is the sum of all of New Zealand's assets overseas, that's assets owned by the government and private, less all of the debts that are owed to overseas and other people's investments in New Zealand. It's our net investment position, and in 2011 it is 78.6% of GDP, slightly better than it was in 2010. And from here on, it gets worse every year. Worse every year. So the Minister of Finance has been telling us that the biggest problem in the country is our net investment position, and from here on it gets worse every year. And that's the effect of the budget and this legislation that we're passing. How can the government crow about that? Worse every year. In fact, it grows from 78.6% of GDP now to 85.3% of GDP in 2015. And we're told that we're already one of the worst countries in the world, and the effect of this budget and the economic management of the government is that by 2015 that gets worse to 85.3% of GDP. A sobering reality as to the effectiveness or indeed ineffectiveness of the government's management. Another point that I agreed with Russell Norman in an earlier contribution, he said, and to get there, you've actually got to have a return to effectively property-based consumption, which is, in his view, signalled by these budget documents. Mr. Speaker, and inside that figure is an assumption that KiwiSaver is going to grow in the way that the government thinks it will as a consequence of the changes it's making to KiwiSaver. The regulatory impact statement that we provided in Parliament today talks about their assessment of the changes to KiwiSaver. Now remember, they're predicting that as a consequence of this, savings are still going to increase. But it doesn't make common sense to me. If you're going to require people to contribute more to their savings with less incentives, how can you credibly conclude that more? How can the Parliament credibly conclude that more people are going to do that voluntarily? Absolutely. How does that work? Now, I'm not the only one that's concerned about that, because if I read the regulatory impact statement, there's lots of riders in there about saying how they don't really know how this is going to pan out, and they're not very confident about it. I'm going to read a couple of sentences out. Our knowledge. The impacts of each option cannot be easily modelled using historical data, given the relative newness of the KiwiSaver savings model. nor is international comparison always appropriate given many of KiwiSaver's unique features and New Zealand's TTE model of taxation. Our analysis of the options is therefore dependent on behavioural assumptions for which there is minimal empirical evidence about individuals' and employers' responses to changes in savings, incentives and other requirements. That's the first thing I'll read out. The next thing they say is that we have also recognised that KiwiSaver is less than 5 years old. Since its launch in July 2007, there have been several significant changes to contribution requirements, which have mostly affected employees and their employers, as well as new providers entering into the KiwiSaver market. The KiwiSaver industry has not experienced any period of stability in which to establish its core products, and this uncertainty and unpredictability is not helpful to either the industry or the savers. Mr. Speaker, it then goes on to say the proposal to increase the compulsory employer contribution rate at the same time as increasing the minimum employee contribution rate will lead to some additional costs on the businesses that employ staff, as well as, of course, to the employees who are contributing, and in the short term may reduce firm profitability. Mr. Speaker, against that background and all those uncertainties, how can the government have any confidence that their changes to KiwiSaver are going to result in the level of savings that they're assuming? And Mr. Speaker, therefore it is possible, in my submission, that if those people aren't saving that money, that the savings that this country so desperately needs to improve the productivity of our businesses so that we've got more capital available to our businesses to grow, to substitute, to invest in more expensive capital plant and things to improve their productivity, we can have no confidence that the government's projections are going to be met. And Mr. Foss, the point about there being upside and downside in forecasts, there are always upside and downside in revenue forecasts. The point that the opposition was making, that even the budget documents note that there's a very large discrepancy between the forecast from inland revenue and Treasury as to tax forthcoming from the corporate sector, and over 4 years, correct? And in the face of that uncertainty, the government hasn't taken the prudent course and taken the lower number. It hasn't even split the difference between them. It's taken the most optimistic number and plugged it into their forecast. So that's another example of wishful thinking on the part of the government. Another area which is poor practice according to the opposition, which is no precedent of which I'm aware, is the government has said that we're going to save $330 million, it's going to save $330 million per annum in respect of programs it's going to cut, but it hasn't identified them. We're expected to believe that. They're expected they're trying to say, Mr. Speaker, that they can be relied upon to find them, and yet we're not told where the government departments are meant to look to find them. Another example of what seems to be voodoo economics to me is that they have imposed on every school in New Zealand the requirement to co-fund the superannuation savings of their teachers. Now, the teachers are entitled, as of any other employer, to opt into the superannuation savings scheme called KiwiSaver. If they do that under the scheme, they'll be saving 3% of their own salary, plus the employer, in this case the school, has to match that with another 3%. Now, that 3%, or until now, 2 years ago it was 4%, and then it dropped down to 2%, and now going to 3%, in the middle, that has to be funded by the school now, whereas previously it was funded by the government. The government used to fund that contribution to match their teachers' savings. Where are schools going to find that? Where are they going to magic that money? Silence from the government. Heads are down. They know there is no answer to that. That's effectively a significant decrease to the funding of every school. Now, I've been a school trustee, Board of Trustees, so have a number of other members of this House. Those schools are constantly fighting to balance their budgets. They're facing inflationary pressures in any event from power prices going up, which will only get worse if the government sells off the SOEs, by the way, which is also counted in their budget forecast, despite the fact that they pretend that this is not yet upon them, that New Zealanders have a choice. They've counted in the budget already as if they've already been sold.
I call